This happened to me in July of 1985. I was living in Kentucky at the time in an undisclosed location. My family has owned property that's been in my family's generation for a very long time and is surrounded by a bunch of wilderness. Let me give you a lay of the land. In the front of the house, it's open yard and our driveway, which is roughly 300 yards and leads to a gravel road. To the left side of our house is our vegetable garden, which is roughly about 16 by 20 feet. And then I would say about another 100 yards of open pasture, followed by a wood line. Behind our house is probably about 20 to 30 feet, and then more wood line. Now, the wood line behind the house keeps going and connects with the wood line on both sides of the house and the pasture. There's also about 100 or so yards of pasture on the right side of the house as well, and then again, more wood line. About 50 yards out on the right side of the house, past the vegetable garden, I have a small tool shed where I keep all my stuff. One night, my wife and I were inside eating dinner, and it was roughly 8 p.m. I remember because it was still sunny outside, but the sun was just starting to set. I started to get a really ominous feeling, and I noticed the hair starting to stand up on my neck and arms. Now, I should note that I had the windows open for a breeze, and out here in Kentucky, you could really hear the wildlife. I noticed that it was really quiet outside as well. Something wasn't quite right. Of course, I wasn't going to tell my wife, so I just brushed it off and continued to have dinner, when not even 5 minutes later, I heard this bang crash sound by the shed. From where I'm sitting, we have a window in which I could perfectly see the shed and the garden. Even in the dusk, I was able to make out and see that there really wasn't anything visually out of place, which I thought was odd. I decided to go grab my .22, which I keep by the door, and go investigate. I just remember walking over to grab my rifle, and right as I put my hand on the door, it's almost like my instincts kicked in, and my entire body just told me, don't go out there, whatever you do. It was the strangest sensation I've ever felt in my life. It's as if I was frozen in fear. So I sat there for a minute, and I waited. I didn't hear anything outside that wasn't normally there, and it continued to stay perfectly silent. So much so that you could hear a pin drop. Now, my wife is freaking out because she senses it too, and I go and I decided to close up all the curtains and lock all the doors. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I just felt in every fiber of my being that it wasn't safe to be outside. Me and my wife decided to go in our bedroom and try and get some sleep for the night. I remember closing my eyes, but there's no way me sleeping was going to happen anytime soon. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is my wife waking me up and hushing me. In a panicked whisper, she was telling me that there's somebody outside of our window. Now, where we live, I know that's impossible since we are miles away from our nearest neighbor. I turned to look over at the window she was pointing to, and just like out of a horror movie, I see the silhouette of a wolf standing upright in our window. The moon was definitely out that night because it was illuminating this thing, whatever it was standing outside the window. It had sharp pointy ears with little tufts of hair on the top of its head, and its entire head was massive and shaped like a wolf. Now, something to note is that our window is like 7 feet off the ground, so this thing had to have been tall and standing to even get its head in the whole window view. And we have those really thin curtains, you know, the ones that cover your window, but just enough to where you can't see anything outside. But if something were to stand in the way, you could definitely make out a silhouette. It wasn't even more than 5 seconds until I first saw it, and that started growling. And it was so deep and guttural, I'm honestly surprised I didn't urinate on myself right there. And then it reached out with its hands and started tapping on the window like it wanted us to let it in, like it wanted us to know we were out there. like it wanted us to know we were vulnerable prey. At this point, my wife is entirely hysterical, and I run out of the room to go grab my rifle from earlier. I run back to the front door and grab the gun, not caring what my instincts tell me, and open the front door to run outside to the side of the house where this thing is. It takes me maybe 5 to 10 seconds to run out to where the window is, and it's nowhere to be seen. I'm looking all around our house, and I want to go back inside. Of course, I don't have a flashlight with me, and the only lights are coming from inside the house, and the porch light, which is just barely illuminating where I am on the outside. I stood outside for a minute or two, looking for this thing, and I didn't see anything. What freaks me out is my hair was still standing up, and the forest was still super quiet. After about a minute, I walked back in the house and checked up on my wife, who is still at this point hysterical, and I asked her what had happened. She said it just left. Her and I weren't really sure what to do at that point, so we just sat there and waited for this thing to come back. It never did the rest of the night, and I don't think her and I fell back asleep until maybe 5 in the morning. Obviously, this was a long time ago, but that was the only time I've ever encountered such a beast. I've never encountered anything like it since, and I hope I never do. I live in Ohio and have ever since I was a little kid. I am now in my mid-30s, and just a couple of years ago, I went camping with my now wife and heard things that I cannot explain. We went on a weekend camping vacation on one of the Great Lakes, actually, and every single night near our tent, we would hear these strange sounds. The first night, we were awoken to a really low growl of a rumble. This growl was honestly the most guttural I've ever heard and sent vibrations through both of our bodies. If this was a predator making this noise, it had definitely had to be a huge one, and had to be the size of a tractor. It would go on and off for a few hours, and then it just stopped. The next night, we kept hearing what sounded like a woman screaming or being murdered, not even a few hundred yards away from our tent, and it circled all around us all night long. I've heard people talk about the Michigan Dogman and other things like that, and even people seeing sightings and reports of this general area, but I've never actually seen anything myself. After that camping weekend though, and after hearing all the strange noises and knowing the general wildlife that lives in the area, I can't be so certain anymore what's actually out there and what actually is not out there. My name is Gray, and I have owned property out in Tulsa County, Oklahoma for the majority of my life. My parents had bought it when they were really young, and it's since been passed down to me. So when I die here in the next 20 to 30 years, I'll pass it down to my kids or my grandkids. I had a very strange experience a few months back. Before I continue on with my story, let me kind of give you an idea of how my property looked. We had a small one-story house, followed by pastures on all sides of the house. Past the pastures was woodline, but these pastures were pretty large. I'd say at least a few hundred yards in each direction. Not too far from the house was my chicken coop. It was a beautiful, quiet evening in April, and it was starting to get dusky outside. My dog Cinderella, who's an old lab and has been my faithful companion for all these years in this house, started acting funny. She started whooping and hollering and whining and growling out the window, looking over at the chicken coop. I told her, "Quiet, old girl. There ain't nothing out there that's gonna get ya." That time went on, and she just got more and more anxious, and finally, she started erupting into a continuous barking with her hair standing straight up on her head, and at that point, I said, "Doggone it, what's going on with you?" Her gaze never left the coop. I figured if there's something going on, she would pick up on it, and this made me uneasy. She went back to ferociously barking, and then went really nervous again and started pacing around. It wasn't even a minute before she ran out of the front door towards the coop. Since it was a nice day and evening out, I left the front door open and the screen door open to let all the airflow come through. My dog goes running towards the chicken coop, and now I'm freaking out. I go running after her, and I'm not even 30 feet away from this coop at this point, and I see this. The only way I could describe it was a classic werewolf. I see this werewolf stand up from behind the chicken coop, and my dog immediately stops in her tracks and just starts cowering. This thing was mostly black with tufts of gray and brown that looks like it ran through its fur, but it had a mane almost like a lion and really sharp pointed ears. What terrified me the most is the way it looked into my soul with its piercing yellow amber-like eyes, like it was observing me and watching what I do and move. It didn't show any signs of aggression, nor did it lift or move any of its body other than just standing up and staring straight at me. After what felt like an eternity, it literally just turned, dropped down to all fours, and ran off towards the woodline. At this point, I was freaking out and ran back inside with my dog, so I can barely even get to move. I locked all the doors and windows and then realized that if I called the police out here, they're never going to believe me. I've lived here for a long time, and so if my parents and I have never encountered any such thing, now I'm worried that my chickens are in danger. I didn't know what I could possibly do besides lock up my windows and doors. Wish me luck. I'm going to take this into my own hands. So, a little bit about me. I'm in my early 40s and I adore the outdoors, and have been doing it all my life with my father. Him and I have been hunting, fishing, hiking, and exploring the woods together for as long as I can remember. He's right, and I've learned everything from him. He's a crazy old man too, and he's still going, even at 67 years old. Me and my dad experienced something together hiking that we both can't really explain, but we both have a really bad feeling about it. This happened to us when we were hiking around the woods of Mississippi in the National Forest of October 2010. Since him and I have been out in the woods together so much, there's really nothing that we're not prepared for or afraid of. Being avid outdoorsmen for well over half of your life, you come to a point where you kind of run into everything the woods has to offer you, or so you think. I'm still not sure exactly what me and my father saw that day in October, but I know it wasn't natural, and I know it was something that wasn't supposed to be there. We had gone hiking for the day and were probably about 3 to 4 hours into our hike when we reached an area in the forest that kind of dips down, almost kind of like a ravine, but only by about 20 or so feet. In this steep, though, was a very large open space where trees didn't really grow, and it was just a clearing. Now, this clearing stretched for probably about 100 yards to maybe another 100 yards. It was rather large. Me and my father stopped at the top of this little cliff and just took in our surroundings and sat for a minute. We usually take a break about every couple hours and have a pretty good endurance, so we're about to start pulling out some snacks and water when we both start getting a really weird feeling. We ignored it at first and started eating, but I noticed within minutes I started feeling it more and more. Do you know that innate fear when you know that a large alpha predator is in the area? That's what it felt like we were being stalked and watched. I spoke up and told my father that something doesn't feel right. We needed to be on our feet and be prepared. When I spoke to him, he was already looking off in the woods, and it seemed like his old eyes were still very sharp because they caught something off in the distance. He didn't reply back to me, but after a few seconds, he calmly said, "Look over there behind those trees," in a hushed whisper. Now, I've been doing this with my dad for a very long time, and as I've already told you, it's pretty rare that my dad gets scared, and when I looked up at him and he had that whisper to me, the fear on his face scared me straight because I knew it was something serious. I looked out and sure enough, behind a few of the trees, you could see a rather large shape. At first, I couldn't quite make it out exactly what it was, so my first instinct was that maybe it was a bear. But we only get smaller black bears here in the south, so it couldn't have been. Whatever this thing was extremely large, and then I went to thinking possibly a grizzly bear, but it was just so dark, and as I'm processing this, I whispered to my dad, "Is that a bear?" He whispered back to me now that this thing looks bigger. At this point, we had been watching it for a few moments, but it started to come towards us into the clearing. Now, keep in mind, this thing was probably only about 4 or 5 trees into the woodline of the clearing. This thing starts moving toward us, and so we could start to make out more details of what it was. It stopped right at the tree line and just stared in our direction. What we were looking at was some monstrously tall wolf on 2 legs. This thing was built like a bodybuilder, but was so black I couldn't really make out any details of the face, since it was roughly still 100 yards away. I can tell its ears were far more pointed, and its head was enormous. Its arms looked really huge, and it looked to have what looks like hands with claws on them. Its legs just resembled that of a dog's, but thicker and more muscular, and a tapered off waist. I didn't see a tail at all. Me and my dad sat there and just stared at this thing for another couple of minutes. It didn't move. It just stayed stationary, staring off at us. It didn't even make any noises, and I didn't smell anything. I had had enough though at this point. I just told my dad we need to get out of there, and we immediately just packed up our stuff real quick and got out and left. Since that encounter, we actually haven't gone back to that national forest, and probably never will. My dad to this day doesn't really like to talk about it, and I'll be honest, it definitely makes me uncomfortable. I've lived down here in Baton Rouge for the majority of my life, as well as the South. I'm now 29, and I clear away from any swamp exploration like I like to do a lot of. It all started back when me and my friends were just teenagers. We just had a knack for hiking and wanted to explore the swamps and all the beautiful areas around the state. That was all good and gravy for a while, until just about 4 years ago, we came into this abandoned house that was pretty boarded up, along one of the swamps that no one really ever goes to. We had traversed quite a few miles in to where you can't go to, and that's when things started to get a little more hairy. It's crazy to traverse into territory that hasn't really been touched by a lot of people, or so it feels like in a very long time. The house we had found had definitely been abandoned for probably well over 40 years, and actually, to my surprise, had barely any, if all, graffiti, and looked like it was just worn and torn down from weathering for the most part. The doors were missing in, and the windows were missing. But other than that, the structure wasn't too terribly damaged. Being avid explorers, we were wanting to go in and check it out. We first entered into the living room that practically everything was missing from, and the walls were scratched up and torn up. As soon as we stepped into the living room, the thick, sweet, sickly smell of wet dog and rotting meat and blood filled the air. This immediately made me and my buddy really nervous, as we're probably about 7 miles out into the wilderness. Why would there be rotting meat and wet dog around? As we exited the living room down a hallway, the smell was coming from an open door at the end of the hall that led down a flight of stairs into darkness, which would be presumably the basement. As we got to the entrance of the stairs, we shone our flashlights down, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything, and neither of us were really wanted to go down and check it out. It didn't feel right, and already at this point I feel like there was something living in the house. The smell was so incredibly strong at the top of the stairs, it was hard to keep from gagging. It was utterly repulsive. Something was nesting down there in the basement, and we weren't about to go and find out. I think once we really got a really strong whiff of what it was, we kind of hightailed it out of there and got the hell out of Dodge. Looking back on the encounter, I am not surprised some sort of animal was living down there. It's the perfect place. It's secluded by miles and miles of dense swamp and brush all around, and protected by an old structure that had been long abandoned years ago, with nobody bothering you. I think we just stumbled upon the den of something we were never supposed to come across. I can't say that it was necessarily a Dogman or anything like that. I honestly don't know what it was, but I can't think of a reason why the pungent smell of wet dog and rotting meat would be so present. This encounter happened to my wife last year while working the night shift and coming home at about 4 a.m. We live out in a pretty rural area, and we have a lot of desolate rural road to get back to our house. As she was driving home early one morning, she had her windows rolled down since it was August morning, and she began to hear something really loud run behind her vehicle. She said it was dark enough that you couldn't exactly make out details, but you could definitely see something, and that there was an outline of something behind her, very large, running and keeping up with her vehicle. This terrified her, as my wife initially told me she thought it was someone's loose Great Dane or something that had just gotten out, and she's terrified of big dogs due to an incident she had with a neighbor's mastiff when she was a child. My wife is doing roughly 40 to 45 down this road, and so she decides to speed it up to about 50, close to 60, and this thing, whatever it was behind her, now is running alongside her driver's side window, and now she's really freaking the hell out. She's looking over at this thing, and she said it looked like the most evil, demonic wolf she has ever seen in her life, and she swears that it looked over and smirked at her in the most menacing, nefarious way. She said it looked a little bit like a hyena crossed with a wolf, crossed with a man. That's also when she told me that she shot it into high gear and sped up to about 80 miles an hour. Now, luckily for my wife, the stretch of road she was currently on was pretty straight, with a minimal amount of curves in it. She said that after a short amount of time, the wolf creature thing stopped following her, and she ultimately lost sight of it. As soon as she got home, she was panicked and pale as a ghost, and was still freaking out and crying. She was honestly a nervous wreck there for a while. She tells me whatever it was just there to scare her, and that she feels like it was so powerful and so evil that if it wanted to get her, it could have. But it just toyed with her, let her know that it was just there as its prey. She still works at the same place and still drives the same route basically because it's really the only way to get to work, but has not had any encounters with it ever since that day. I was driving home late at night, probably about 11:30 or so at night. There was only ever a few other cars on the road. I came across a bend in the road, and as it curves around, something large and black ran across the road, and as my headlights hit it, it looked like a deformed-looking hyena-wolf cross hybrid, or something weird like that. I have never seen an animal that looked so strange, and it looked like it was uncomfortable in its own skin, like it couldn't move properly, and its front legs were longer than its body allowed. It cleared the road pretty quickly though, but it just freaked me out due to the sheer size of this thing. It was humongous, and I've never seen a wolf or animal that looks anything like what I saw. I literally had to slam on my brakes since it jumped right out in front of my car and trailed off across the road. My windows were rolled down, but I didn't smell anything, nor did it make any noise, and I did not see any eyeshine. I haven't really told anybody about this since they'll think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you this is exactly what I saw that night. I was driving around really late one night. It was probably 1 in the morning, and I was getting back from a friend's party. Now, the neighborhood I live in is obviously residential, but we're surrounded by a lot of thick woods. There's a long stretch of road, maybe about a mile, and there's thicket on both sides of the road that separates the residential area to another. I was driving this road, heading back to my place, and I probably had about a good 3 minutes until I hit the general neighborhood area. As I'm driving, I noticed some eyeshine coming from the right side of the road, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. I figured maybe it was just a deer, but as I started to get closer, within seconds, I noticed it was the hugest wolf head I have ever seen in my life staring up at me from the thicket. What scares me is we don't have wolves around here, and the thicket and bramble is pretty tall, and so for this thing's head to be above it would have to be well over 8 feet tall. As I get closer and drive past it, all I literally saw was a giant wolf head staring at me through the bramble, or at least its head sticking out. What's weird is I've looked up other Dogman encounters and other reports about having glowing eyes, etc., but these eyes were just normal eyeshine like you would if you were to shine your headlights on a deer. It just didn't feel right though. The head was too huge, and there's no reason any wolf head should be 8 feet off the ground in the middle of thorns and bramble at night. It still gives me the creeps to think about. Oh, and I'm sure it doesn't help too that we're surrounded by a lot of thick woods in the entire area, so there's that. Plus, there's many deer that traverse, so this thing would have plenty of food to use. This encounter happened to me back in 1979 in El Paso, Texas. This was back in my early 20s when I lived out there. I later moved on out of the area and stayed for reasons of employment, and I'm glad I did. What I encountered that night still gives me nightmares to this day, and I will never go back. In my early 20s, I reached a pretty good spot financially due to my uncle getting me into real estate and doing it with me, and so we were making pretty good money at it. So I was just a single guy, no wife, no kids, just living by myself, living the typical bachelor life. Well, one thing I loved to do was take morning walks, and I would walk about 5 miles every morning to stay in shape. I love adventure though, and would usually hike outside of town. This particular hike occurred at Mammoth's Trunk Trail, a little ways out of town. This hike is pretty rigid with a lot of rocks and hills, but after making my way a little bit through is when I had my encounter. I got up around 4 or 5 in the morning and began my walk. I had done this trail before, so at one point or another I had veered off the path quite a bit, and after being about a couple hours into my hike, I needed to relieve myself naturally. I'm standing there behind a very large stone, pissing on the ground, when I begin to hear a really low growl, and it sounds like it's coming from about 10 feet away from me. I looked over my shoulder, and literally, not even 10 feet away, standing there, is the largest wolf I've ever seen in my life. At this point, I just urinate all over my foot as I'm frozen in fear, looking at this wolf that's literally the size of a buffalo. This thing had piercing amber eyes, and its teeth didn't even look right. They were really large, and it kind of had a hyena look to it, like if you went to cross a wolf with a hyena. I honestly thought it was going to attack me and kill me, but then after a few seconds, I heard the voices of some nearby distant hikers, and immediately this thing looked over with its ears perked up, kind of like how a dog does when he hears something. As it looked over, I looked over to the nearby voices and I was hearing, and I looked back towards the wolf, and it was gone. I didn't even see it leave. Apparently, these other people who I was hearing and also veered off the path in the same direction I was conveniently, and they were maybe only about 100 feet away. The way sound travels in this area is strange, and they sounded much closer, which I was actually hoping for. After pissing all over my own foot and leg and losing all the good in me, I ran out to these people and told them they needed to leave and that there's a really large predator in the area. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I sat there trying to convince them of what just happened to me, and they seemed like after some time thought I was genuine enough to convince them. So I don't know what happened back there, if that was a dogman or what. Whatever it was wasn't standing up, it was on all fours, but I know wolves don't get to that size. I'm not sure if it was a direwolf or not, but it was literally the largest predator I've ever seen in my life. It was easily the size of a lion, if not bigger. This encounter happened to me just a few years ago when I went camping with my brother, my dad, and my uncle out in Wisconsin in the U.S.A. National Wildlife Refuge. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, it's basically a giant bog with a variety of other trees like aspens and oaks, etc. The wildlife is pretty extensive and diverse too, with all sorts of birds and critters, so we knew going into it that it's probable we would run into something, but not like something we actually did encounter. My dad always keeps a rifle on him, and we have flares and other forms of safety equipment and tools to ward away potentially threatening animals. We usually do since we enjoy camping a lot, and it's just good to be prepared. We're actually residing in Texas at the moment and live down there, but our uncle lives up here in Wisconsin, so we like to visit him every year up here and do a big hiking trip together. Now, this camping trip began for our usual spring break week-long camping trip. We hiked into the bog about 6 or 7 miles and decided to set up camp. Usually, what we'll do is our first day, we'll hike for about 5 to 10 miles and set up camp, and then spend the next few days exploring the area and hiking before we move camp and venture even further. We came to a really nice little clearing next to a rather large swamp. Even being in March, it was still pretty comfortable to be in. We set up camp, cooked wieners over the fire, and drank beer, and then crashed out for the night. All I can say is I'm glad this happened on our first night before we got too far into the swamp. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to some noise in our camp and some scratching on our tent. At first, I thought it was another camper going through our stuff, but I realized we were quite a ways out in the middle of nowhere. There's no way somebody is out here going through our stuff. It sounded like a large animal, and I know the bog is home to many and much variety of wildlife, but I could hear this thing breathing and wheezing. Whatever it was sounded huge and bipedal. It sounded at times like it was stomping around our campsite, but then it would just stop for a moment and then growl really heavily. Think of like a wolf's growl, but magnify that times 100. You could literally feel the bass of the vibrations through your body. For some strange reason, my brother, my father, and my uncle must have really drank a lot because they were passed out hard. Of course, I was the only one awake while this was going on, and now I'm freaking out in my sleeping bag. It's pitch black outside, and I don't have a firearm or any weapon to access directly. It wasn't even a second later that this thing comes right next to the tent, and I could hear it not even 2 feet away, growling and breathing. It was so terrifying. The best way I can describe it to you is it literally sounded like there was a lion that was 3 times its normal size right outside of our tent, snarling and growling. It stood there for a moment, and then paced around our tent a couple times, and then all of a sudden, as soon as it came, it left. It wasn't until after it left that I noticed the noise in the swamp started to come back. Now that I think about it and look back, while that thing was stomping around, all noise outside of our tent was pretty much pin drop silent. Even though this whole thing only lasted maybe 10 minutes at most. I feel literally traumatized and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I explained to my uncle and my brother and father the next morning when it happened, and they chalked it up to me just seeing or hearing a really large wolf or some other large predator in the area, and thought it would be in everyone's best interest to pack up and leave. Even though they didn't necessarily believe what I had to say, I did appreciate though that they at least kept in mind safety precautions and were at least convinced enough that there was some large predator out there in the area that they were unaware of. If you're ever in central Wisconsin, stay out of the bog. There's nothing in there for any of us.